they trained him for assassins. For pressure devices in motorcade wheel wells. For the shape of a threat in a crowd, the way a man who means harm holds his shoulders differently from a man who's merely late. They did not train him for this. A 9-year-old boy. A whisper in a corridor. An audio file 43 seconds long. By the time Prince Louis pressed play on that recording in the East Corridor of Windsor, giggling, because he was 9 and thought secrets were a game, Corporal James Whitmore had already been standing at that post for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Boots like concrete. Back like iron. Face like a man carved from the specific granite they use for headstones. He heard everything. He was supposed to hear nothing. And, when the Queen Consort arrived 11 minutes later with that particular stride, the one that means someone is going to have a very bad morning, Whitmore made a decision in the span of a single breath. Some men reach for a weapon. He reached for a phone. What happened in the next 4 minutes has not appeared in any official record, any briefing document, or any palace statement. It appeared, briefly, on the floor of the East Corridor. In pieces. This is the account of what I observed. I have changed no material facts. I have omitted only the things that would end both our careers if I wrote them plainly. Lieutenant Commander D. Ashby, Royal Household Division, filed under personal correspondence, not for distribution. The East Corridor at Windsor smells like beeswax and something older. Something that has been carpet and stone and cold for so long it has become its own genus of smell, the specific scent of a building that expects you to behave. I was not supposed to be there. My rotation that morning was the South Garden perimeter. A nothing post. Ceremonial. The kind of duty they hand to officers they're quietly managing out of relevance. Stand here, look official, wait for a pension. I had accumulated enough quiet infractions over the previous 18 months to warrant exactly that kind of management. I knew it. My CO knew it. We had reached a mutual understanding through the elaborate British military language of polite invisibility. But Corporal Mabry had twisted his ankle on the service stairs at 0610, and someone needed to cover the East Corridor rotation, and I was, per my commanding officer's words, delivered with the facial expression of a man eating a disappointing sandwich available. So, East Corridor. 0645, me, my notepad. I keep a notepad, always, a habit that makes my colleagues visibly uncomfortable, and Corporal James Whitmore, who had been at his post since before I'd finished my second coffee. Whitmore is the kind of guard that makes the other guards look decorative. 6'1". Built like a man who has never in his life made a rash decision. His ceremonial uniform sat on him the way a suit sits on a diplomat, as though the clothing understood its assignment. He had a scratch on the right pauldron of his breastplate he'd been trying to buff out for 3 weeks. I'd noticed it in briefings. He noticed me noticing it now, and the angle of his jaw shifted approximately 2 degrees. We did not speak. That is normal. That is correct. The East Corridor in the early hours is a church of professional silence, and Whitmore was its most devout member. The boy arrived at 0703. Prince Louis, 9 now, he'd had a birthday, I kept forgetting, came around the far end of the corridor in the boneless, gravity-optional way that children move when they believe no adults of consequence are watching. Blue pajama trousers. A sweatshirt that said something about dinosaurs. Socks with no shoes, which explained the silence of his approach. He was carrying a phone. Not his own. The case was wrong, navy blue, gold corner reinforcement, the particular brand of protective case favored by women of a certain generation who have been told by younger relatives that they keep cracking their screens. I recognized it because I have an aunt with the same case. I recognized it because I had seen it in briefing photographs. It belonged to the Queen Consort. Whitmore saw it at the same moment I did. I know this because I watched his eyes move a microadjustment, down and left, a recalibration, and then return to forward facing with the specific discipline of a man who has decided that what he just saw is not, currently, something he is seeing. Louis padded to within 3 meters of Whitmore's post and stopped. He looked up at Whitmore the way children look up at guards, with the particular mixture of awe and impish calculation that comes from knowing you are technically untouchable. Royals don't get shouted at. Royals don't get escorted away. Whitmore was a very large immovable object, and Lewis was a child who had spent his entire life being told, in the most loving possible terms, that the rules did not entirely apply to him. He pressed play. The audio was not loud. But, the East Corridor is built from the acoustic philosophy of a different century: everything carries, everything returns, everything finds you. 43 seconds. I caught fragments. A voice I recognized from enough official functions that my stomach registered it before my brain did. Considered the particular cadence of a man who was accustomed to rooms listening. And then, a second voice. And then, a sentence that I am not going to write in this document, not because I am being coy, but because writing it makes it real in a way I am not prepared for before my third coffee. Lewis watched Whitmore's face the entire time. This is what disturbed me most. Later, when I was reviewing my notes in a car park on the M4 with the heater running, and the particular sensation of a man who has made a career choice he cannot unmake. The boy wasn't playing the recording to be naughty. He wasn't showing off. He was conducting an experiment. He wanted to see what a guard's face did when it heard something the guard was not supposed to hear. Whitmore's face did nothing. 43 seconds of nothing. A man carved from the specific granite of Windsor's own foundations, standing at a post he'd been assigned, hearing something that, if it meant what I thought it meant, was going to reorder the interior geography of several very significant lives. Nothing. The recording ended. Lewis lowered the phone. He looked at Whitmore with the expression of a child who has just discovered that the magic trick did not work and is now recalibrating his theory of magic. "Did you hear that?" he said. The voice of a 9-year-old asking a 6'1" ceremonial guard whether he'd heard a piece of audio that could. I was already doing the mathematics in my head, the way you do when you've worked near power long enough to develop an instinct for blast radius. I will not complete that sentence. Whitmore said nothing for 4 full seconds. Then, Your Royal Highness ought to return to his room. Did not hear it. I'm sorry, sir. Please lower the volume. Ought to return to his room. Lewis considered this. He looked at the phone. He looked at Whitmore. He performed the calculation that 9-year-olds perform when they're deciding whether an adult is genuinely immovable or merely performing immovability. He decided, correctly, that Whitmore was the genuine article. He turned and padded back down the corridor in his socked feet, phone in hand, with the unhurried confidence of a boy who knows that secrets are temporary and breakfast is not. I wrote 3 words in my notepad. I looked at Whitmore. He was already facing forward again, eyes at the correct angle, spine at the correct degree. The scratch on his pauldron caught the corridor light. I had 11 minutes before everything changed, and I did not know it. There is a particular walk. Every person of consequence in a royal household develops one eventually, a compression of authority into movement, so that the rooms adjust before the body arrives. I have seen it in generals. I have seen it in the Archbishop of Canterbury on a bad liturgical day. I have seen it, most memorably, in a catering supervisor named Doris who ran the staff canteen at St. James's for 22 years and could clear a table of junior equerries with a glance. Camilla, Queen Consort, had the walk of a woman who had spent 3 decades being underestimated and had reached a stage of life where she found that quietly entertaining. She arrived in the East Corridor at 0714. I know the exact time because I checked my watch when I heard the footsteps, a reflex I have from a period in my career I don't discuss at functions, and the second hand was between the 2 and the 3, which puts it at 0714 and approximately 20 seconds. She was not in ceremonial dress. Gray trousers. A cream blouse. Low heels that struck the corridor floor with the metronomic certainty of a woman who has worn practical shoes to enough state occasions that she has made them elegant through sheer repetition. Her hair was done, which told me she had been awake long enough to have a plan for the day. She was carrying nothing. That was the first thing. She was carrying nothing, and the phone was not in her hand, and her face had the specific quality of glass that has not yet cracked but knows exactly where it intends to. She saw Lewis at the far end of the corridor. He had stopped again, apparently reconsidering his retreat, standing 30 meters back with the phone behind his back in the internationally recognized posture of a child who has decided that hiding something behind his back constitutes hiding it. The Queen Consort's stride did not break. Did not accelerate. Did not register the boy with any visible change in velocity. She walked to Whitmore's post. Whitmore came to attention with the precision of a man whose body has been trained to perform correctness while his mind does something entirely other. I could see, from my angle I had positioned myself near the corridor service alcove, which is both unprofessional and, in retrospect, a decision that has materially shaped the last 6 months of my life. I could see the line of his jaw. The set of his shoulders. The 2-degree adjustment that was, I was beginning to understand, Whitmore's entire vocabulary of reaction. "Corporal," she said. "Ma'am." She looked at him the way you look at a map when you already know where you're going but want to confirm the route. A brief, comprehensive assessment. The kind of look that takes in a scratch on a pauldron and a notepad in an observer's hand and a 9-year-old socked feet and the acoustic properties of a corridor and arrives, in approximately 3 seconds, at a conclusion most people would need a full briefing to reach. "Did my grandson come through here this morning?" "Yes, ma'am." "Was he carrying something?" A pause. Not long. Not the pause of a man deciding whether to lie. Whitmore, I had concluded by then, was constitutionally incapable of lying by omission to a member of the royal family within their own residence. The pause of a man who was locating the most precise version of the truth available to him. "He was carrying a mobile phone, ma'am." The Queen Consort turned and looked down the corridor at Lewis, who had not moved and was radiating the specific guilt field of a child who has realized that being 9 does not, in fact, confer invisibility. What happened next I have reconstructed from my notes, from the corridor's acoustic properties, and from the expression on Whitmore's face, which was the expression of a man watching something he has been trained to prevent and has been given absolutely no protocol for addressing. Lewis held out the phone. Not because he was told to. Not because he was frightened. He held it out with the unsettling, clear-eyed candor of a child who has decided that the experiment is over and the results should be submitted to the appropriate authority. She took 3 steps toward him. Took the phone. And, in the motion of turning back toward the corridor, a pivot, a single fluid rotation, her wrist struck the stone window embrasure at a precise and unambiguous angle. The phone left her hand. Hit the floor. The corridor performed its acoustic function. The sound was significant. Lewis flinched. I flinched. Whitmore did not flinch because Whitmore was, I was becoming convinced, not entirely governed by the same startle reflex as the rest of us. He stared directly forward at the far wall and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has witnessed something that has no entry in any protocol manual and is, in real time, composing the entry. The Queen Consort looked at the phone on the floor. Then, she looked at Whitmore. "Corporal Whitmore," she said. Her voice had the register of a woman who has attended enough diplomatic functions to speak across a room at a volume that carries exactly as far as intended and no further. "I wonder if you might take care of that." Whitmore's eyes moved down. The phone was not shattered. The navy case with the gold corners had done its job, a crack across the screen, a spider fracture running upper left to lower right, the kind of damage that places the device in a definitive category, not functioning, not reparable, not evidence. Not anything, anymore. He bent and picked it up. When he straightened, the Queen Consort was already walking back down the corridor toward the south wing, her stride carrying its usual metronomic authority, Lewis following 3 steps behind with the look of a boy who has just watched an adult perform a magic trick and is revising his entire theory of magic. I wrote 2 words in my notepad. Then, I crossed them out. Whitmore held the phone in his left hand, facing forward, and, for 31 seconds, I counted, he stood at his post with a broken device in his fist and the expression of a man deciding, with great deliberation, who he is. I have worked near power for 14 years. I know what a decision looks like when it's real. The thing about the household division is the paperwork. Not the ceremonial kind, not the duty rosters and the rotation schedules and the official logs that get reviewed by people with the seniority to care about them. The other paperwork. The kind that lives in the margins, in the personal correspondence files, in the notebooks that officers aren't technically supposed to keep but keep anyway because some of us have a need, compulsive, irrational, the kind of need a therapist would have opinions about, to record what we saw. I filled 4 pages that morning. Then, I went to a car park. Then, I sat with the heater running. Then, I drove to a petrol station outside Maidenhead and bought a coffee that tasted like a decision I hadn't made yet, and I sat in the car with my notepad on the passenger seat and I looked at what I'd written and I understood, with the slow particular clarity of a man who has been trying not to understand something for several hours, what I was holding. Whitmore filed his incident report at 11:30. I know this because I have a contact in the administrative division who owes me a professional debt from a situation in 2019 that we agreed would never be discussed at functions. She confirmed the filing. She confirmed the timestamp. She confirmed, in the careful language of someone who has also spent 14 years working near power, that the report described a minor damage incident involving personal property, no security implications, no personnel injury, resolved on post, no further action required. 6 lines. 6 lines for 43 seconds of audio that I cannot get out of my head, for a 9-year-old boy in dinosaur socks, for the sound of a phone hitting a stone floor in a corridor that was built to carry exactly that kind of sound precisely as far as needed. 6 lines. I have worked with Whitmore on 3 previous rotations. He is not a man who writes 6 lines. He is not a man who writes no security implications when he has heard what I heard from that recording. Fragments, yes, corridor filtered, yes, but fragments that assembled themselves into a shape I recognized the way you recognize a word in a foreign language you studied briefly and badly 20 years ago. Enough to know what direction it's pointing. Not enough to swear to it. Not enough to file it. I went back to Windsor at 1400. Mabry's ankle was being assessed. I was technically still covering the East Corridor rotation. Whitmore was at his post. The corridor was empty and smelling of beeswax and old stone. He saw me clock back in. He said nothing. I stood at my position, service alcove, which I'd elevated to a post in my own mind out of sheer necessity, and I looked at him and he looked at the far wall, and between us was the specific silence of 2 people who have witnessed the same thing and are conducting separate negotiations with themselves about what it means. After 20 minutes, I said, Mabry's going to be back Thursday. Whitmore said, good. I said, East Corridor's a nothing post. He said, yes, sir. Which was, in Whitmore's vocabulary, approximately a paragraph. I translated it in real time. You were not supposed to be here. You were not supposed to hear this. The fact that you were and did is a problem that currently lives entirely inside your head, and how it remains there is your own professional challenge, not mine. I wrote that translation in my notepad and then looked at it for a while. Here is what I know about Corporal James Whitmore, compiled from 3 rotations, 2 shared briefings, and the evidence of a single morning. He is not a man who operates from fear. The 6-line report was not filed because he was frightened of what he'd heard. It was filed because Whitmore had looked at the blast radius, the same calculation I'd been running since 0703, and had made the specific determination that the correct action, for a guard whose entire function is protection, was to reduce the radius to 0. Not loyalty to the recording's content. Not loyalty to the person who made it, or the person it implicated. Loyalty to the household. To the function. To the idea that a 9-year-old boy should be able to return to his room in his socked feet and eat breakfast and not become, through no fault of his own, the pivot point around which several very significant lives begin to break apart. The phone was a physical object that contained a dangerous thing. Whitmore had been handed a physical object that contained a dangerous thing. He had filed 6 lines. This is either the most cynical act of institutional self-preservation I have ever witnessed in 14 years of working near power, or it is something I don't have a word for yet. I drove home at 1800. I put my notepad in the kitchen drawer where I keep things I'm not ready to throw away and not ready to use. I made dinner. I watched the news, nothing, of course, nothing, the particular polished surface nothing of official life in which large things move silently beneath a reflective calm, and I thought about the scratch on Whitmore's pauldron that he'd been trying to buff out for 3 weeks. In the morning I checked my messages. There was one, sent at 22:47 from a number I didn't recognize, a mobile, no name attached. 3 words. The boy knows. I read it twice. I went to the kitchen drawer. My notepad was exactly where I left it. I picked it up and I stood in my kitchen at 0615 in the gray particular light of a morning that had not yet decided what kind of morning it intended to be, and I looked at 4 pages of handwriting and a coffee ring from a petrol station outside Maidenhead and 2 crossed out words on page 3. Then, I turned to a fresh page. I began at the beginning. Because Whitmore filed 6 lines, and someone sent me 3 words at 11:15, and somewhere in Windsor a 9-year-old boy in dinosaur socks is eating breakfast and deciding whether secrets are still a game. I do not know who sent the message. I know they had my number. End of part 3. Lieutenant Commander D. Ashby, personal file, not for distribution, filed, undated.